Hi everyone, hope you're well. What's going on? The Obi-Wan Kenobi dressing gowns had to go back on because it's got cold again. Sorry about that. One of these days the hood's going to have to go up as well. No matter, Psalm 72 is a cracker, and we're going to start by talking about the title. So we've said before that some of these Psalms have titles underneath. People usually ignore them, but they're actually really important, really interesting. And we talked about the titles which are about David, like a Psalm of David, which usually people take to mean written by David, but it can, people argue about whether it could actually mean it was in the dedicated to David, or written by David, or written for David, or in the style of David, or a tribute to him. This week we've got the Psalm of Solomon. The title is really significant, and it's the key to unlocking this psalm. So Solomon was David's son, and that's symbolically important because it's his lineage on the throne afterwards. And that relates to a promise that God had made to David in 2 Samuel, saying that he will always have a descendant or a man on his throne for eternity. And it was part of the covenant promise that God had made to David. And as time went on in both Israel's history and in the kind of compiling of the Bible, it became clear that these promises about David's line, about his descendants, were not to be fully realised by either one of his sons or his near descendants. In fact, some of these poems could well have been compiled or gathered during a time when actually Israel and Judah had been exiled and Jerusalem had been destroyed. So they're probably written in retrospect. And it ties in with a lot of what the prophets said. They began to interpret these promises about David's descendant, David's royal descendant, as something that was for the far future, not because clearly it couldn't have been true of the near future since the line had ceased. So there's a shift there from seeing stuff from the kind of near future to the far future, almost in a prophetic way, about an even greater character there. So it became understood that this king would take the form of a coming Messiah. And as I said, the prophets began to speak that message more and more clearly. And so also this song here, this hymn, or however you want to describe it, it took the form of a kind of messianic song. We can read it that way. So it speaks of this royal figure that bears Solomon's name. And we can see from looking at what we know about Solomon in the Bible, that he was David's son too, and also we can learn a lot from his life, the kind of real history of his life in the Bible. And everything that we read about him is true, but it kind of hints at the future Messiah that was going to come. He became a little bit of a preview of what that future Messiah was going to be like. So when we go into the Bible and read accounts of Solomon's life, there's aspects of his character and his rule which, although they're far from ideal, for example, he subjected his own people and he enslaved them in order to build his great projects and to do all of his commercial activity. He married many wives, and they eventually turned his heart against God. And by the way, that marrying of wives, it's not just that he was a womanizer, that possibly what was going on. The having of many wives was making political alliances in order to further his interests as well. So it was about the political power as much as they were about lust. So anyway, there were things that were far from ideal about Solomon. However, there were aspects of his reign which were so good they became symbolic of perfect rule, or almost idyllic kingship. And there were things like this. He built the temple which housed God, and that kind of hosted a system of worship which meant that God was at the centre of the life of Israel's people. So that was a high point. He subdued Israel's enemies, and not only that, he actually extended the borders of Israel and reclaimed some of the old provinces and places that had been lost before. It had unparalleled prosperity during that time through his trade and through the harvests. It did very well as a nation. The goodness and beauty of Solomon's kingdom was so renowned that kings and people came from all over the world to hear his wisdom and to see the splendour of his palaces and to witness what he was doing. And it was a man and a kingdom which just showed that God was with them and that God was blessing. And it was such a high point that it almost came to have this idyllic sense to it. It came to be a foreshadowing of the ideal reign of the future Messiah. And I want to illustrate it with this. In Luke 18, there's a blind man, this is in the life of Jesus, a blind man by the road who shouts out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." That's verse 38 of Luke 18. Why is he calling Jesus the Son of David? What's this all about? Is it merely a thought that Jesus was related to David in some way? Well, the genealogies suggest that, but there's more to it. He's giving him the title of the ideal king, the kind of great Solomon type king. He's saying, Jesus, you are the one that Solomon was only a foretaste of, just a dim shadow. You are the real thing. And so Solomon, who brought the peace and the justice and the victory and the feeding, the sustenance and prosperity that glorified God amongst the nations, the blind man who couldn't see clearly was able to see who this really was, that this is the real king who's there, the Messiah who brings food and justice and healing and wisdom and safety, and make God present right here. He's the one that he can see is coming and who he's going to put his trust in. So really interesting. This is the greater Solomon that's present here. So as you read through this Psalm 72, you'll notice the fact that although you have one or two hints that this connects to the royal figure, the historical Solomon. For example, in verse 10, you see the mention of Sheba, and that is a hint at Queen Sheba, who in 1 Kings 10 came to hear his wisdom and see his splendour. And actually, further on in that chapter, it talks about the whole earth coming to see him, to marvel at his glory. We see in verse 4 a reminder of the saving the children, which reminds us of the incident where he settles the squabble between the two women who are fighting over the child. He sorts that out. Verse 10 mentions Tarshish. That reminds us about Solomon's wealth. He sent ships from Tarshish all over the world to trade and bring more prosperity back to Israel. And the mention of Lebanon in verse 16. Solomon used trees from all over the place, but particularly Lebanon, these cedars, for his big building projects, and particularly the temple. So there's hints of connections to Solomon's real life there in the Psalm. However, there's more than that. There's hints that there's a king here that has an even greater dominion. So there's a king here that rules not just over Israel, but he's the king of everywhere. So verse 1 and 2, also he's a king of all justice. In verses 3 to 7, he's the king of all provision and protection. Notice particularly you see all elements of creation, the sun, the moon, the mountains and the rain involved here. And it mentions prosperity. Verses 8 to 11, he's the king over all peoples and significantly over all other kings. And finally, he's the king of the needy and the oppressed. Verses 12 to 14. A greater ruler than even Solomon, the son of David, is here. And I just want to take you to two more phrases before I stop. And the first one I think is really significant is this. In verse 19, we have the phrase, "May the whole earth be filled with his glory." Now, in the Bible, there's only ever two places where glory fills something. And the first one is the earth, just like it says here. In Numbers 14:21 and Habakkuk 2:14, it has exactly the same phrase, that the whole earth will be filled with the glory of God. The only other thing that's filled with God's glory is the temple or God's house. And where we see that is Exodus 40, Ezekiel 10, Ezekiel 43 and 44, and then Haggai chapter 2. But the most notable example of this filling the temple with glory occurs in 1 Kings 8 and in 2 Chronicles 7. And who is presiding over the ceremony where God fills the temple with his glory? That's right, it's King Solomon. So this psalm is unquestionably about a greater king who will not just fill a temple with glory, but he will fill the whole earth with glory. It's not just a building here. Second thing I want to make you alert to, and you're maybe familiar with this, verse 17, it might ring a bell, and it's the God's call to Abraham. Now, Abraham was the first one that God called apart from all of the nations. It comes after the Tower of Babel incident in Genesis 11. In chapter 12, God calls one man out of the kind of corrupt and wayward nations, and he says, rather than starting again like he did with the flood, which basically wiped out humanity, he says, I'm going to start again, but I'm going to take you out of creation and start something new. He calls Abraham as part, and he says, I'm going to use you to bless the nations. And what's really interesting is what he means by that is he's going to use his offspring. So Genesis 15 and 17 in particular make that clear. He's going to use his offspring. And offspring in the Hebrew can either mean a singular seed or it can mean a generation, like lots of seed as well. So there's kind of an ambiguity there, but that in itself is really interesting. So he's again talking about the one descendant, perhaps, of Abraham, who is going to bless all of the nations. The whole earth will be blessed through you. And so what we have here is the king who is the true son of David, but who's also the true son of Abraham, the one who will bring blessing and prosperity and healing to all people who trust in him. Amazing. So just to finish, the last two verses 18 and 19, are incredible as well, because it's just somebody who's given over to praise and wonder. They're just in awe of this thought. And what it looks like is the writer, who's written this way before Jesus, somehow has caught a glimpse of this future Messiah King and a glimpse of what he has come to do, what he will do, and it simply takes his breath away. And I think these last two verses is just his way of inviting us to be amazed along with him. Enjoy your study.